Long before banks, before coins, before governments as we know them, the world's first economic empires were not ruled by kings. They were ruled by gods. In ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, temples were not just places of worship, they were the beating heart of the economy. The gods did not merely receive prayers, they controlled food, labor, debt, and survival itself. To the people of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, the temple was the safest place on earth. It had thick walls, armed guards, divine authority, and most importantly, storage. Grain flowed into temples as offerings, taxes, and tribute. Farmers surrendered a portion of every harvest not as charity, but as obligation. In return, the temple promised protection, order, and survival during famine. Over time, this transformed temples into the first centralized warehouses and the first financial institutions. Whoever controlled grain controlled life. The gods, through their priests, decided who received food, when it was released, and at what price. During good harvests, grain was stored. During bad years, it was rationed. This wasn't generosity. It was power. A population that depends on centralized food cannot rebel easily. Temples also became the world's first banks. They issued loans, not in coins, but in barley and silver by weight. They recorded debts on clay tablets, carefully cataloged by scribes. Interest was charged. Deadlines were enforced. Defaults were punished. Entire families could fall into debt bondage under the authority of the gods. But because the system was sacred, it was unquestionable. If a temple demanded repayment, it was not greed. It was divine order. The priests who ran these systems weren't merely religious figures. They were accountants, administrators, and economists. They tracked inventories, calculated wages, managed labor, and regulated trade, all under the illusion that the gods themselves demanded it. This fusion of religion and economics was genius. By tying survival to worship, Mesopotamian societies ensured compliance without constant violence. The people believed the system was natural, moral, and eternal, because it came from the heavens. In reality, it was the first economic empire. An empire built not on armies but on storage, not on coins but on accounting, not on force but on belief. And once grain, debt, and labor were centralized under divine authority, the gods of Mesopotamia achieved something no ruler before them ever had. They turned economics into destiny. In ancient Mesopotamia, wealth was not measured in gold or silver. It was measured in grain. Barley was life. It fed families, paid workers, settled debts, appeased gods, and whoever controlled grain controlled the future. The Mesopotamian economy was built on one brutal reality. Harvests were unpredictable. Floods could destroy crops. Droughts could starve entire cities. One bad season could erase years of labor. In that environment, survival depended on storage, and storage was centralized in temples. These temples were not small granaries. They were vast, fortified complexes designed to hold food for entire populations. Grain flowed into them from every direction, as taxes, offerings, and mandatory contributions. Farmers had no choice. A portion of every harvest belonged to the gods. But this wasn't charity, it was leverage. By stockpiling grain during good years, temples gained absolute control during bad ones. When famine struck, the gods, through their priests, decided who ate and who didn't. Grain was released slowly, rationed carefully, priced strategically. Scarcity was not just endured, it was managed. This allowed temples to do something revolutionary. They stabilized prices. When grain flooded markets after a harvest, temples absorbed excess supply. When grain vanished during shortages, temples released reserves. Prices didn't move freely. They moved according to divine policy. This was ancient price control, and it wasn't done for compassion. It was done for order. A starving population panics. A rationed population obeys. By controlling supply, temples controlled behavior. Farmers stayed loyal. Workers accepted wages and grain. Traders followed temple rules. Debt repayments were enforced in barley quantities defined by temple standards. Grain even became a unit of account. Wages were measured in liters of barley. Rations were standardized. Labor contracts were priced not in abstract value, but in survival itself. This created a terrifying dependency. If you worked, you were paid in grain controlled by the temple. If you borrowed, you owed grain to the temple. If you starved, only the temple could save you. The gods didn't need armies to rule. They had granaries. And once a society accepts that survival flows through a single authority, markets stop being free. They become managed ecosystems, where prices, wages, and access are tools of control. This is why Mesopotamian civilization lasted as long as it did. Because grain storage wasn't just an economic innovation, it was a political weapon. And once food became power, the next step was inevitable, turning that power into money, debt, and permanent obligation, recorded not by faith alone, but by written law. Long before coins jingled in pockets or paper carried value, Mesopotamia ran on something far more powerful than money: accounting. In this world, silver was not currency you spent. It was a unit of measurement. Silver existed mostly as weight, measured, not minted. No faces of kings, no official coins. Just precise quantities recorded on clay tablets by temple scribes. Barley fed the people. Silver balanced the books. This was money before money. Temples and palaces became the first accounting hubs in history. Every transaction was written down. Loans issued, wages owed, grain distributed, interest accumulated. These clay tablets were not symbolic. They were legally binding contracts backed by divine authority. Debt was not abstract, it was permanent, and it followed you. A farmer could borrow barley during planting season, promising to repay after harvest. A merchant could receive silver credit to fund a trade journey. A laborer could accept rations in advance. Every obligation was recorded, sealed, and stored, sometimes for generations. Interest was standardized. Deadlines were fixed. Penalties were enforced. And failure to repay had consequences. If a debtor defaulted, the temple didn't negotiate. Property could be seized. Family members could be taken as debt servants. Freedom itself became collateral. Debt was not just financial, it was social control. What made this system terrifyingly effective was its legitimacy. These records weren't enforced by kings alone. They were enforced by the gods. Breaking a contract wasn't just illegal, it was sacrilegious. This gave Mesopotamian institutions absolute power over economic life. They didn't need police to chase debtors. Faith did the work. Fear of divine punishment kept the system running smoothly. This was the birth of institutional trust, not trust between individuals, but trust in records, measurements, and centralized authority. For the first time in history, wealth could be tracked independently of physical possession. You didn't need to hold silver to owe silver. You didn't need grain in storage to be responsible for it. Value became abstract, portable, and enforceable. This abstraction changed everything. It allowed large projects to be financed, labor to be coordinated at scale, trade to expand beyond local barter, states to plan years ahead. But it also introduced a dangerous imbalance. Because when value exists as records instead of reality, power belongs to those who control the records. And in Mesopotamia, the gods controlled the books. Once debt, money, and obligation were written into clay, the economy became something no individual could escape, a system that bound labor, food, and survival into a single sacred ledger. And the next step was inevitable. If value could be measured, it could be controlled, not just through debt, but through wages, labor rules, and state employment, all dictated from above. In Mesopotamia, labor was not negotiated. It was assigned. Work did not belong to the individual. It belonged to the gods. Temples and palaces became the largest employers in the ancient world. Farmers, builders, herders, scribes, porters, entire populations worked not for private masters, but for divine institutions that controlled food, wages, and survival. And wages were not decided by markets. They were fixed by decree. Laborers were paid in standardized rations of barley, oil, wool, and sometimes silver, all measured precisely and recorded by scribes. A worker did not bargain for higher pay. He received what the system had already decided his labor was worth. This was the world's first wage control system. A skilled craftsman received more grain than an unskilled laborer. A scribe received more than a porter. Overseers received more than builders. But these differences were rigid, codified, and justified as divine order, not economic negotiation. The result was stability. People knew exactly what their labor would earn. Employers knew exactly what labor would cost. The state could plan years ahead, but stability came at a price. Because once wages are fixed and paid in necessities, labor becomes dependent. Workers no longer worked to accumulate wealth. They worked to survive. Grain wages kept people alive, but rarely allowed them to escape the system. If you lost your job, you lost access to food. If you resisted authority, you lost rations. If you disobeyed, you starved. This was not cruelty. It was control. The temple state did not need prisons to enforce obedience. It controlled calories. Large construction projects, canals, walls, temples, ziggurats, were made possible by this system. Thousands of workers could be mobilized, fed, and maintained without wages spiraling upward or markets overheating. Labor supply never rebelled because labor had nowhere else to go. Private enterprise existed, but it lived under the shadow of the temple economy. Independent workers still depended on temple grain during bad seasons. Merchants still needed temple credit. Everyone eventually passed through the system. This created an economy that looked stable on the surface. Predictable wages, controlled prices, organized labor, but deeply fragile underneath. Because when labor is disconnected from incentive, productivity stagnates. When wages don't respond to effort, innovation slows. When survival depends on obedience, resistance disappears until the system cracks. The gods of Mesopotamia solved chaos by freezing the economy in place. And for centuries, it worked. But no system built on total control survives forever. Because when labor becomes rigid and wages stop adapting, pressure builds, silently, invisibly, until the structure holding everything together can no longer bear its own weight. And when that pressure finally released, even divine authority was not enough to stop the collapse. In Mesopotamia, markets were not free. They were managed. Prices did not rise and fall based on supply and demand alone. They moved within boundaries set by divine authority. The gods, speaking through kings and priests, decided what goods should cost, and when they should cost it. This was not theory. It was law. Clay tablets recorded official prices for grain, oil, wool, beer, labor, and silver. These were not suggestions. They were edicts. Violating them meant fines, confiscation, or punishment. Trade existed, but only within limits the temple state allowed. The reason was simple. Uncontrolled prices threatened order. If grain prices spiked during famine, panic would spread. If wages rose too fast, temple projects would stall. If silver lost its reference value, debts would become unstable. So the gods intervened. By fixing prices, Mesopotamian rulers believed they were protecting society from chaos. In reality, they were protecting the system that kept them in control. Price stability ensured predictable wages, manageable debts, and social compliance. This was ancient macroeconomic policy. During shortages, prices were capped. During abundance, surpluses were absorbed into storage. When markets overheated, edicts cooled them. The most famous example came much later, under Hammurabi. His code didn't just define crimes and punishments. It defined economic life, how much a worker could earn, how much rent could be charged, how much interest was acceptable, how much compensation was owed for labor or loss. Justice and economics became inseparable, but price controls carry a hidden cost. When prices stop reflecting reality, markets lose signals. Producers lose incentive. Shortages appear quietly. Black markets form. Trade moves underground. What looks stable on the surface becomes fragile beneath. Merchants learned to hide goods. Traders delayed sales. Farmers withheld supply. The gods could fix prices, but they could not fix human behavior. And yet, for centuries, the system held. Why? Because enforcement was sacred. Disobeying a price edict wasn't just illegal, it was defying divine order. Fear sustained the system long after logic failed. But fear is a temporary foundation. When trust erodes, when shortages grow, when faith weakens, control breaks down. And once markets begin to move beyond divine authority, the entire sacred economy starts to unravel. Price edicts could freeze instability for a time. They could delay collapse, but they could not prevent it. Because no economy, not even one ruled by gods, can permanently suppress reality. And when reality finally asserted itself, the sacred economic empire faced a reckoning it could no longer manage. For centuries, the Mesopotamian gods ruled the economy with precision. Grain was stored, wages were fixed, prices were controlled, debt was recorded, labor was managed. On the surface, the system looked eternal. But no economy built on absolute control survives forever. The first cracks appeared quietly. Harvests became less predictable. Climate shifts altered river floods. Soil fertility declined after generations of intensive farming. Grain yields weakened, and storage stopped being a buffer and became a strain. Temples released reserves faster than they could replenish them. Debt began to pile up. Farmers borrowed more just to survive. Interest compounded. Families slipped into debt bondage. Land concentrated in the hands of temples and elites. The economic base, once broad and productive, narrowed dangerously. This was the moment when control turned inward. Rulers issued more edicts. Priests enforced stricter repayment. Punishments intensified, but repression could not restore productivity. When wages are fixed and prices frozen, economies lose adaptability. Labor stops responding to incentive. Innovation disappears. Trade retreats into shadows. Black markets replace official markets. Trust erodes. And once trust collapses, belief follows. People no longer saw the gods as protectors. They saw them as enforcers. Faith weakened. Obedience became reluctant. The sacred authority that once stabilized society began to feel like a burden. Then came political shock. Invasions intensified. City-states fell. New rulers inherited broken systems. The temples still held records, but the resources behind them were gone. Clay tablets still listed debts, but the population could no longer pay. The gods had promised order. Reality delivered collapse. Some rulers tried reform. Debt cancellations were issued. Land was returned. Obligations were erased. These were not acts of mercy. They were acts of survival. Because when debt overwhelms production, when control replaces incentive, and when belief no longer holds society together, the system must reset or die. Mesopotamia did both. Its sacred economies collapsed, but their ideas survived. Grain storage, accounting, wage control, debt records, and price edicts didn't disappear. They migrated into secular states, empires, and modern institutions. The gods lost their thrones. The systems they built did not. And that is the final lesson of the Mesopotamian economic empire. The most powerful financial systems in history were not created by markets or money, but by belief, control, and administration. And when belief fades, even divine economies fall.